Hello, viewers. Today I will share with you a fascinating study titled Using Deception in Markov Game to Understand Adversarial Behavior Through a Capture the Flag Environment. This research explores a strategic method to strengthen our cyber defense mechanism, particularly in dynamic tactical networks, through the use of honeypots and game theory in Capture the Flag environment, and it will discuss about adversarial behavior through Capture the Flag. This is the table of content that we'll be focusing on. These are the topics that I will be discussing in more detail throughout the presentation. Finding out who poses a threat to a system's weakness has always been tough in cybersecurity. We are using game theory to help defenders make smart moves against attackers by studying how human attackers act. We can find and figure out the best defense strategy. Here we are using Markov games to model attackers and defenders showdowns and find the best strategies. Our approach has been tested using a capture the flag environment and user studies on attackers with different skills. Here, they found that tricking attackers at the application level works better than traditional method like patching or blocking. This finding leads us to think about how attackers behave when they are stuck in a fake environment, and we have analyzed that in detail. In cybersecurity research, efforts to develop effective strategies for defending system against threats often rely heavily on assumptions about what attackers do. We commonly assume that adversarial act rationally, seeking the greatest benefits. However, this assumption doesn't always align with real-world scenarios. Despite this limitation, it remains a fundamental aspect of models used to compute optimal defense strategies, largely due to its demonstrated practical value. So, by understanding and addressing these assumptions, we can enhance our approach to defending against cyber threats. Moreover, in cybersecurity, using tricky tactics to counter attacks adds complexity to interactions between attackers and defenders. So the deception methods like honeypots have proven effective in disrupting attacks and learning about attackers. And understanding how attackers behave helps defenders use resources efficiently to deploy deceptive tactics and reduce potential threats. This knowledge can greatly improve decisions making models, minimizing the assumption defenders need to make about attackers to make the model work. Our research focuses on embedded honeypots, which are decoy environments that blends in with real services. So providing defenders with crucial insights into attackers' technique in real-world scenarios additionally can demonstrate what the benefit for defender may vary. When attackers don't behave as anticipated in real-world scenarios. So the contribution can be summarized as a real-world capture the flag environment with three systems vulnerabilities, conducting studies with human participants of varying system and attack expertise. Simultaneously, they modeled the interaction between attackers and defenders as a Markov game determining its Bayesian-Stackelberg equilibrium. Initially, they set the input for this game based on expert knowledge. Later, they discovered and adjusted these inputs, particularly for scenarios involving attackers trapped in honeypot configuration, utilizing statistical findings from user studies. So, this helped them understand discrepancies between obtained equilibria and real world observations. Moving further, in this section, I'll start by giving a quick summary of capture the flag setup that they have used for their user studies. Then I'll introduce the actual vulnerabilities that they targeted and they used to create the test environment, along with the defense methods they used to protect against them. I'll also explain the Markov framework as we go along the video, which they used to determine the best defensive strategy. Moving forward, capture the flag setup. Capture the flag setup, it is basically the primary goal of conducting the user studies is to gather realistic data on attackers' behavior using CTF environments rather than artificially generating the data based on commonly accepted assumptions over adversaries. One way to achieve this is through creating prototypes components to run CTF style experiments. They further integrated them into an existing open source framework known as the ICTF framework. This infrastructure allowed experiments to be run with a sizable number of human subjects to gather enough data for the desired results. The ICTF framework is core framework used for conducting user studies. So it is primarily used to attack and defense style CTF competitions every year. For the purpose of collecting data for this study, they made several modifications to the existing implementation of their framework. So most of these modifications include deploying defense mechanism and data collection tools. Since their main goal is to simulate real life scenarios, they choose three vulnerabilities, which are still prominent in current software applications, and develop three corresponding vulnerable application for this purpose. The vulnerabilities were selected and deployed in a manner that it is possible to exploit them in a reasonable amount of time, therefore faithfully representing typical large-scale cyber attacks. The vulnerabilities selected included command injection and buffer overflow. The vulnerable applications were written in C and Docker sized to isolate them from the host machine. Also, all modern security modifications and mitigation, including positions, independent executable data execution framework, and address space layer randomization were disabled. Moving ahead, they created three distinct applications with vulnerabilities. The first one they called is backup. It lets users store and access data stored as file on the system. In one function of this application, it combines a user input with a string and send it to C function called system. However, the system's user's input isn't properly checked, leading to a vulnerability known as command injection. The second application named sample AKey provided users with the ability to save and access notes stored as files. Unlike the backup application, Simple AK included a password feature. Users must input a password when creating a note and enter the correct password to retrieve it. However, there is a vulnerability in this way user input is handled. The function read unintentionally read more bytes than the buffer can handle, leading to a buffer overflow vulnerability. And the third vulnerable application was called exploit market, which allowed users to store, retrieve, and list payloads stored in program's memory. The vulnerability in this application arose from buffers initialized with different sizes in separate functions. When the script by function was used to copy buffer content, a carefully crafted payload can cause a buffer overflow. Additionally, there is an intentional bug in the form of a memory disclosure leaking heap, which addressed the string buffers. I'll also discuss the defense and analysis tools that they were used. Now they have implemented defense mechanism to protect their vulnerable application. These include using SNOT, an intrusion detection system on a router acting as a gateway between attacker and defender machines. SNOT used rule-based configuration to defend and prevent attacks, including common shellcodes used for exploitation across different architecture. Additionally, they have enhanced a live patching framework to incorporate cyber defensive attack countermeasures to gather vulnerable information about attackers and defenders. They have deployed tools on their host machines, which included TCP dump, which captures network traffic for analysis, and sysflow, a custom system call monitoring framework. Sysflow encodes system activities into a compact format, capturing process integrations with system resources like files and networks. So this provides a comprehensive context for post-exploitation analysis. Moving ahead to attack graphs. So attack modeling technique like attack graphs offer a way to visualize cyber attacks on computer networks. However, generating these graphs for large network is challenging due to scalability issues. So our system and study focuses on a simplified version of attack graphs, which were nodes which represented vulnerable hosts and edges which represented specific attack paths. While this simple model may not cover every vulnerability, it helps illustrate potential attack routes that attackers could exploit. So, this understanding is crucial for developing effective strategies for allocating honeypots and capture the flag environment. It's worth noticing that the attack graph may not directly incorporate mobility. They can adapt them effectively for model mobility in tactical networks. In essence, attack graphs serve as a roadmap for potential cyber attack, highlighting vulnerable points in the network. So, by simplifying these graphs and focusing on key vulnerabilities, they can develop better strategies for defending against attacks, such as developing honeypots strategically. So, while attack graphs may not initially account for network mobility, they can modify them to accommodate dynamic network conditions, making them invaluable tools in cybersecurity and defense. Attack graphs served as valuable tools for illustrating, exploiting possibility, and understanding adversary behaviors. So, an attack graph is depicted as GVE, where V denotes vertices on nodes representing various states that adversary can occupy, and E denotes the edges connecting these nodes, representing the actions the adversary can take to transition between exploit stated. In simpler terms, the attack graph shows the different stages an attacker may go through and action them can perform them to move between these stages. For instance, an attacker may start by scanning for vulnerabilities, then attempting to exploit them, and finally gain unauthorized access. Attack graph basically visualizes cyber attacks on a computer networks, providing a roadmap of vulnerabilities and potential attack paths. Generating attack graphs for larger network possesses scalability challenges, making it difficult to handle complex network structure. This study focuses on a simplified version of attack graphs where nodes represent vulnerable hosts and edges depict specific attack paths. Despite its simplification, this model effectively illustrates potential attack routes that attackers could exploit within the network. Moving further, we'll talk about the Markov game strategy. So now let's break down and explain each point. So S is the set of states. This is the collection of all possible situation or conditions in the game. Then we have action set. It's a combination of action available to both the attackers and the defender. Then there is transition probability matrix. This matrix shows the likelihood of moving from one state to another when the attacker takes an action and the defender takes an action D. Then we have utility function, which determines the reward or benefits received by the player in a given state when a specific action is taken. A discount factor Y, this considers future rewards, although it's not straightforward to assume the same discount factor for both players. For simplicity, we assume gamma is equals to Y into D or Y into A. Economics, so the modeling dynamic decision making in uncertain environment. And computer science algorithm designs, which particularly is the reinforcement for learning and optimization of the whole network. Then the biology of the game is studying evolutionary dynamics and popular behavior. Then we have optimal mixed strategy. It computes the best strategy for the defender, considering various experimental settings and input parameters. And the last one is transition probability matrix variation. So depending on the adversary's threat level, the transition probability can change. Testing our model with different parameters helps us understand these variations better. So they calculated the best mix of strategies for their defender in various scenarios, as explained in further sections. Since Markov games component rely on vulnerabilities and defenses in place, the transition probabilities might change depending on the threat from the attackers. So this inspires them to test the model with different settings, which they have discussed in the further model and which I'll be explaining further. Talking about the methodology, in this setup, they assumed that there are three vulnerabilities in the system, labeled as exploit 1, exploit 2, and exploit 3. The defender may honey patch one of or more of these vulnerabilities. Honey patches are special security fixes that don't alert attackers when their exploit attempts fail. So instead of blocking the attack, a honey patch redirects the attacker to a separate honeypot environment. This makes the attacker think they are exploiting an unpatched vulnerability, allowing the defender to capture these actions until the deception is revealed. So this paper displayed a scenario where all three vulnerabilities were honey patched. If some vulnerabilities weren't honey patched, the attack graph would be similar, but those specific vulnerabilities led to a real flag, not a honeypot flag. At the game start, the attacker can choose which vulnerability to exploit. For example, if they target the honey patched exploit 1 first, they end up in the state 1, trapped in a decoy without capturing the real flag. As the game progresses, the attacker moves through different states until reaching a terminal state where I and J were ranging from 0 to 3, and their sum is at most 3. So this means the attacker can get either flag for each exploit or none of them. So in this study, they aimed to examine two distinct attacker behaviors where they have ensared in a honeypot setup. So they outlined the underlying assumptions for each hypothesis that we'll be discussing further. In the game theory, a hypothesis refers to a proposed statement or assumption about the behavior of rational agents within a strategic interaction. So these hypotheses served as foundational principles that guided the analysis and understanding of decision-making processes in game. So they were often formulated based on observation, theoretical consideration, or empirical evidences. So hypotheses in game theory can range from predictions about individuals' behavior, such as players' strategies choices in a particular game, to broader assumptions about the equilibrium about their strategic interactions. So they provide a framework for testing and refining theories as well as for making predictions about how agents will behave in different situations. So the first hypothesis that we'll be talking about is attackers' behavior assumed cautious exploration of the environment to honeypot. And the second hypothesis was attackers' behavior assumed aggressive exploitation of vulnerabilities regardless of honeypot presence. Talking about the first one, this assumption presumed that the attacker remained unaware of the deception, specifically in a scenario where a honeypot flash was acquired. Consequently, the attacker processed with their current strategy unabatedly by concerning about encountering further traps. And it got vibrant at the peak. Moving further and talking about the hypothesis number 2, which is aggressive exploitation. So this assumption suggested that the attacker became cognizant of the altered situation, especially when a honeypot flag was detected. Consequently, the attacker opted to modify their current strategy, aiming to evade the honeypot environment. So this adjustment enabled the attacker to retry exploitation in the honey-patched vulnerability while evading entrapment in the honeypot. If the attempt to evade the specific honeypot configuration fails, the attacker's awareness of the deception prompts a more cautious and observant approach towards subsequent honey patches in their attack strategy. So next we'll talk about the user study, which helped them observe the different attackers' behavior from each adversary. So the ICTF framework was designed for hosting large-scale attack defense capturing the flag events involving multiple teams, with over 100 such events already conducted. So in their system studies, particular participants which acted as attackers while security defense mechanism as a defenders. So the attacker's machine contained identical copies or vulnerable applications, allowing them to analyze and identify vulnerabilities and developed exploits. So on the defense's machines, the vulnerable applications were deployed with different security mitigations or without any mitigation. Each Docker container running the vulnerable application contained a pre-generated string known as the flag placed in the root directory. The attacker's objective is obviously to exploit the vulnerability and exploit the flag, achievable only by successful exploitation of the vulnerable application. So each participant receives ample time to focus on each service. So they attempt to exploit one service at a time, following the consistent order of backup and simple peek and exploit markets. Moving further to Markov game modeling, which provides a structured approach to defense decision making in dynamic attack scenarios, which offers insights into balancing mitigation, cost, and further expectations in the vulnerable management, enhancing understanding of defender strategies to mitigate evolving cyber threats effectively. Then the utility matrices. So the attack graph shown, there are different set of actions available to both the attackers and defenders as the same game progresses. In action set 1, the attacker has 4 options to do nothing, try to exploit vulnerability 1, 2, or 3. The defender also has 4 choices: no mitigation, apply a honey patch to vulnerability 1, 2, or 3. Lastly, in action set 3, the attacker is left with 2 actions: to do nothing or try to exploit vulnerability. Similarly, the defender also has 2 actions remaining: no mitigation or applying a honey patch vulnerability. Then understanding the defender's strategy is crucial for mitigating evolving cyber threats, providing valuable insights for developing robust defense mechanisms. Experimental evaluation and results. Through initial experiment studies, they observed that employing honey patching yields the highest reward for the defenders compared to having no mitigations or using snort against vulnerability exploits. As a result, they focused on analysis on scenarios where the defenders opt for honey patching one or more vulnerabilities. So these scores evaluated the exploitability and severity of the 3 vulnerabilities considered in the study. And the table exclusively lists honey patching actions for defenders, and the utility scores computed using common vulnerability scoring system. Moving further, after conducting 6 pilot studies and making necessary infrastructure adjustment to gather data on the adversary behavior, they processed with 18 user studies. Participants were selected from a pool of individuals known to process the required skill set in vulnerability analysis and software exploitation to incentivize participation. So each participant received $50 USD prior to commencing the studies. They obtained approval from institution and institutional reviews and compared these scenarios with mitigation or using SNOT against vulnerability exploits. And the score accesses the exploitability and severity of three vulnerabilities considered in the study. Throughout these case studies, the remaining probabilities were allocated to no mitigation actions for defender, ensuring the total distribution over actions which equal to 1.0 and illustrated on the screen. Furthermore, these were related theories which were discussed in the paper. So when considering both uniform and non-uniform costs for the defender mitigation strategies, they observed minor discrepancies among the three models, mainly in initial three state of the game. So these states represented key scenarios as shown on the screen, which model suggested through roughly 0.5 probability for deploying honey patches after first vulnerability exploit, indicating benefits of trapping attackers in honeypot early. This is the related work which was also discussed in the paper. So researchers like Galinkin L categorize attackers as either risk adversary or risk seekers. But recent efforts involving learning attackers' behavior through the analysis of previous collected networks, packet, and data. So cybersecurity exercises are widely employed for educational purposes and experimental analysis, aiding in the understanding and resolution of cybersecurity issues. So these are the references that I have used for my presentation. Thank you so much for watching my presentation. This is Vipin Singh signing off.